Hilchos, Tumas, Tzaraas, Perek Shmini, the laws of impurity imparted by Tzaraas, chapter 8. We're still talking about Tzaraas developing on people's bodies. However, today's chapter is like a new section. It's a new type of Tzaraas. Till now, we're dealing with spots or with lesions that develop on the skin, on healthy skin or over a burn. Today, we're going to be talking about, as the Rambam in the very first word says, Halacha Aleph, Nige Harosh veHazakon, lesions of the head and the beard. A unique type of Tzaraas that develops only on the head and the beard area. Now the truth is, already in chapter 5, we discussed Tzaraas related to the head and the beard. The Tzaraas of Karachas and Gabachas, unnatural baldness. That if somebody's hair completely falls out, either in the front part of his head or the back part or the beard, then that skin becomes treated like regular skin, and many of the laws of regular Tzaraas apply to those locations. But that's all in the category of regular Tzaraas, where it's a spot developing on the skin. Just over there we were saying that if the hair of the head or the beard falls away, that area becomes like skin. Now we're talking about Tzaraas that develops on the hair. While there's hair on the head, while there's hair on the beard, there could be a type of lesion that develops in the area of the hair. And this type of lesion is called nesek. Till now we're using the word nega. Nega means lesion, but lesion on the skin. In today's chapter, we're going to be talking about nesek. Nesek is the term for a Tzaraas lesion in the hair. And as we're going to see, it's not a spot, but it's actually a bald spot, a lack of hair. When the hair falls out in a specific way, then that's called a nesek, a lesion on the head. As we had with Tzaraas of the skin, there's two parts to making a lesion impure. First of all, the lesion itself, the spot itself, needs to meet the qualifying standards, and then there has to be a siman tuma, a sign of impurity develop in the spot. Same thing as with the nesek. A nesek, which we'll translate as a bald spot, has two parts. First of all, the spot needs to bald in the way that qualifies according to the Torah, and then there needs to be a sign of impurity develop within that spot, which the Rambam will label what they are. So let's go and learn the Rambam inside. Halacha Aleph, Nige Harosh veHazakon. Lesions that appear on the hair of the head and the hair of the beard is not a white spot like we had when it came to skin. Rather, hu sheyipol haseir shebahen meikare. It's when the hair that's in the head and in the beard falls out of its roots, v'yishar mekayim haseir panoi, and the place where the hair used to be now remains empty. So a bald spot within the hair. Today, this is also a condition that's known, but of course, Tzaraas is not a physical condition. It's a manifestation of something spiritual. So while it looks identical to this, but it's not a physical, scientific, medical concept. But it basically would be where an area of hair completely falls out, whether on the head or on the beard. This is called nesek. To qualify as a nesek spot, it can be no less than a square gris. Same size as regular Tzaraas, 6 by 6 hairs area. Same thing with the head, 6 by 6 hairs area. There's a difference though between the nesek and regular Tzaraas, and that is bein shahaya mar'ehu amik, bein shaloi haya amik. It doesn't matter whether it looks deeper than the rest of the skin or not. When it comes to Tzaraas of the skin, so what did we say? The white spot needs to look deeper than the skin. Torah says mar'ehu amik min ha'or. The appearance needs to be deeper than the skin. Not actually, it just means like sun and shadow. The sun always looks deeper than the shadow. When it comes to a nesek, that condition is not required. Now, even though if you look in the Torah, the word amoik is used when it comes to a nesek. This is talking about a person who comes with a lesion on his hair of his head or his beard, and it says the kohen sees the lesion, v'hinei mar'ehu amoik min ha'or. Behold, the appearance is deeper than the skin. So what do you mean deep is not a requirement? Deep is a requirement. The Rambam immediately clarifies. The only reason Torah says the word deep when it comes to the neseks, is only to tell you, it's to teach you a rule about neseks. Just like the idea of deeper looking skin is something that's imposed by the hands of heaven, so too a nesek, which could become impure, has to be a type of bald spot that was made in the hands of heaven. Which excludes a bald spot that was created by human intervention, which is pure. In other words, if you pluck out enough hairs to create what would classify as a nesek, it doesn't classify as a nesek, because a nesek needs to be something that's made by God, not by humans. And that's the reason that the word amek is used, amek, in other words, as a hint to the concept that it has to be heavenly intervention, not human intervention. But as for the depth itself, it's not required that it look deeper than the skin. Says the Rambam, a woman or an impotent man whose beard area produced hairs is subject to the laws of nesek, even though it's not natural for them to grow hairs in this way. But if it does, as long as there's enough hair in the area and then the hair falls out to qualify as a type of bald spot, they could become impure with the impurity of nesakim. Now, what is the impurity of nesakim? So we know what the spot is. It needs to be completely fallen out hairs, and it has to be 6 by 6 hairs long and wide. What are the signs of impurity that have to appear? Hanesakin, mitamin, bishnei simanim. Neseks, bald spots on the head, transmit impurity or become impure when they have one of two signs of impurity. B'seyar tzohiv dak, thin, yellow, goldish hairs, ubepisyain, or spreading. If 2 yellow, goldish hairs appear in this bald spot, or the bald spot spreads bigger than it was when originally inspected, after a week of quarantine like we had when it comes to Tzaraas of the skin, then this is a sign of an impure nesek. The Yeshba and Hesger Shnei Shavuos, they also have a maximum of 2 weeks quarantine, like Tzaraas of regular skin. All of this is explicit in the Torah. You can read through the verses. The whole process is delineated clearly in the passages. And the Rambam summarizes it for us in halachic language. Ketzad, what does this mean? A person wakes up one morning and he sees that a bald spot has been born in his hair, on his head, or in his beard. So he goes to the Kohen, and the Kohen immediately checks for signs of impurity. Now, of course, he cannot check for spreading, because spreading can only happen later. So he checks for the yellow hairs. If there were 2 or more yellowish, goldish, short hairs, the word dak typically means thin, but the Rambam will soon clarify that it means short in this case. Short, yellow, goldish hairs. And there is no black hair at all inside the space of the bald spot, because as we'll soon see, black hairs remaining in the bald spot actually is a saving mechanism from impurity. So there has to be a sign of impurity and no saving signs, no black hairs. So then, if there's nothing there, yachlit, immediately upon inspection, the Kohen will declare the person decidedly impure. Loy hoyaboy, seyar, if there was no hair at all. Loy shacher, not black to save. V'loy tzohiv, but not yellow, gold to impurify. Yasgir shavua echad, you put him in quarantine for a week. Ubashvi reyehu, and on the 7th day, the Kohen inspects him again. And now, 2 potential signs are possible to impurify. Im nelad by seyar tzohiv dak, if a yellow goldish hair appeared. 2 yellow goldish hair appears. Oisha pasa hanesek, or the bald spot spreads, yachlit, the Kohen makes him decidedly impure. Nildu by shtei sidus shcheides, if 2 black hairs had come up, had grown during this week, yifteiraisa, he's exempted, because the 2 black hairs become a saving mechanism. They have healed the nesek, in the Torah's terms, and he gets sent home. Loy pasa, v'loy nelad by seyar tzoiv, v'loy seyar shachar, if it's all the same, it hasn't spread, no yellow goldish hairs sprouted, no black hairs sprouted. So now you're going to put him in for a 2nd week of quarantine. Over here, the Torah, however, gives one specific instruction. Yegaleach svivais hanesek. He needs to shave all around the bald spot, the hair around the bald spot, v'lo yegaleach hanesek, without shaving the actual bald spot. Now, how do you shave a bald spot? A bald spot is bald, you can't shave it. So the Ramban writes on the Torah, his commentary, that it means, literally, you can't put a razor over the area of the bald spot. Special law in the Torah. Other commentaries explain it means, as the Rambam will actually himself say very soon, you have to leave a small row of hair around the bald spot. Otherwise, you've effectively shaved the bald spot. If you shave all the hair around it, now you won't know where the bald spot's borders originally were. So you have to shave around it, but leave a little fence of hair around it so we can tell later if it spreads. The way we'll know is if those hairs also fall out. That's how they explain, don't do a type of shaving which will effectively make the bald spot disappear. But you do this shaving, and then you put him in quarantine for a 2nd week. The Kohen comes back and checks him on the end of the 2nd week. If either of the 2 signs came, 2 yellow goldish hairs sprouted, or the nesek spread, yachlit, he's declared to be impure. If nothing came, yiftar, he's exempted. She'ein hesgir b'nesakin yasar al shnei shavuos. Because there cannot be more than 2 weeks of quarantine. But, like when it came to the skin, after he was sent home, he wakes up later and he finds the yellow goldish hairs have sprouted, or the bald spot has spread, yachlit, he is decidedly impure once again. Halacha Gimel, we mentioned shaving the nesek. Ketzad negalchin asa nesek. How does one shave the area around the bald spot in preparation for the second week of quarantine? Megaleach chutzalai, says the Rambam, you shave the hair outside of it, umaniach shtei sayres samuchle, but you leave 2 hairs all around. Kadeshiyah nikar apisyan, so that potential spreading would be recognizable. You could know if it spread by dint of the fact that more hairs fell out. V'tiglachta ikshera b'chol adam. The shaving can be done by any person, meaning even though the checking of Tzaraas and the whole process must be only by a Kohen, anybody can do this shaving. Shenemar v'his galach, because all it says is v'his galach, the person shall be shaved. It doesn't say v'gilach, that the Kohen who's being spoken about in the previous verse should shave him. The person should be shaved. However he's shaved, by whoever he's shaved, it's all fine. V'chein kshera b'chol davar. And also, even though in other cases the Torah requires that razor be used for different shavings, over here you can shave with anything. Ba'afilu haya nazir, hareze megaleach. Even if he happened to be a Nazirite, and now some Tzaraas developed, he needs to go through this shaving that's required. It overrides the mitzvah of having the hair grow, which is said by a Nazirite. Which, by the way, we had a whole chapter on that in the laws of the Nazirite, quite a complicated chapter, how the Nazirite and Mitzvah can override. By the way, the commentaries say that when a Nazir gets a shaving, you should minimize the act of shaving in whatever way possible. So better not to use a razor, better to use a lotion that will cause the hair to fall out. If you can use a child or a Gentile to do the haircut, you should do that, so that it's not completely it's having a regular full adult Jew overriding the mitzvah. But the shaving must be done. If the Kohen puts him in quarantine a second week without doing the shaving, hareza muskar, it's still an effective quarantine. Because still, afterwards you'll be able to see if it spread or if the yellow goldish hairs grew. But the Torah does say it as an optimal mitzvah of shaving before the second week of quarantine. Now, we keep talking about yellow hairs, yellow goldish hairs. What is the status of these yellow goldish hairs to be a sign of impurity? Seyar tzoiv ha'amr b'Torah. When the Torah says the word seyar tzoiv, Kohen is inspecting for yellow hairs, hu sheyiyeh kitavnis hazahav. It means it needs to look similar to gold. That's the word tzohiv. I know today Amari Rabban knows tzohiv means yellow, but the word tzohiv in its literal sense is related to zahav, which is gold. Tzohiv means it's goldish, yellow goldish. V'zeh shenemar dak, and when the Torah says dak, which typically means thin versus thick, that's not what it means over here. Hu sheyiyeh katzar. It means it needs to be short. Shorter than all the rest of the hairs. Shorter than the natural state of the hairs on this person's head. It can't be too short. It has to be long enough to be able to be picked with a scissor. As we've seen a couple of times, that's the minimum amount for a hair to be called a hair. But it has to be shorter than the rest of the hairs. Avalim haya ardach, but if it was long, natural to the, on par with the rest of the hairs. Afal pishu tzohiv ketavin hazav, even though in colorization it's the proper color, it's goldish yellowish, eine simen tuma, it's not a sign of impurity. Because Torah says both conditions. Seyar tzohiv dak, yellow and short. Got to be both. Halacha hey, shtei sayres hatzubes hadakos. When you do have 2 yellow goldish short hairs, they are a simen tuma. They are a sign of impurity. Bein shahayuzu b'tzadzu, bein shahayu meruchakay zumizu. Doesn't matter the location. Maybe they're right next to each other. Maybe they're far from each other. Bein shahayu be'emtza hanesek, bein shahayu b'soif hanesek. Whether they were in the middle of the bald spot, at the edge of the bald spot, and here different to the white hairs on the skin. Bein shekadam hanesek as haseyar hatzoiv, bein shekadam haseyar hatzoiv as hanesek. It doesn't matter if the bald spot came before the sprouting of the yellow goldish hairs, or the yellow goldish hairs were there before the bald spot. If there is yellow goldish hairs in the middle of a bald spot, hareihu simin tuma, that's a sign of impurity. V'hu sheyun italis bezug, they have to be big enough to be able to be picked with a scissor, as we explained when it came to the white hairs of Tzaraas of the skin. Halacha vav, we mentioned before that there's black hairs. Black hairs in a bald spot could be a saving mechanism. Now what we're going to see is that there's 2 categories of black hairs. There's leftover hairs and there's new hairs. Leftover hairs would mean that most of the hair in the bald spot fell out, but there was at least 2 black hairs that stayed in the bald spot. New hairs would mean after the bald spot was discovered Analysts, let's say, was sent to quarantine. After a week, we see, there's new black hairs growing. Both of these types of black hairs are a saving mechanism, but they have to meet different conditions. And you know what? Maybe we should look at it on the screen over here, and then we'll see it in the Rambam. The Rambam says that leftover hairs, in order to be a saving mechanism, have to be 2 hairs. Number 2, they have to be not just long enough to be picked with a scissor. They have to be long enough to be bent over. That's a little bigger. The top of the hair needs to be able to be bent over to the root of the hair. It's a little longer. And number 3, they have to be in middle of the bald spot. There has to be at least 2 hair breadths all around of baldness around the hairs. Whereas, if it's new hairs, first 2 are the same conditions. They have to be 2, long enough to be bent over, but new hairs can grow anywhere in the nesek. Anywhere that they grow, there'll be a saving mechanism. Now let's see it inside. Haseir hashacher, hamatzil b'nesakin, when we talk about black hair, that serves as a saving mechanism in a bald spot, ein pachis mishtei saides. Number 1, cannot be less than 2 hairs. Number 2, they don't save until their length is enough to bend their top to their root. And bein shahayu zu b'tzadzu, bein shahayu mefuzare. So it doesn't matter if they were one next to another or they were spread apart. However, and the Rambam is talking about now leftover hairs, v'hu shayiyu be'emtza hanesek. They have to be in middle of the nesek, not smack in the middle. The point is, v'yishar min hanesek ponui. It has to be in the bald spot, an empty space, between the black hairs in it and the black hairs outside of it, the area of 2 hairs growth. But if the leftover 2 black hairs were left literally at the very edge, the border of the nesek, and there aren't 2 hairs breadths past them to the regular hair, they're not a saving mechanism. If they're leftover hairs. If they're new, that's fine. But if they're leftover, they don't save. Keitzad matzilos. What does it mean that they save? Saving means she'im nishar b'seich hanesek shtei shcheiros. If 2 black hairs were left over in the bald spot, afal pi she'noilad b'nesek se'artzoiv dak oisha pasa, even if the signs of impurity developed. There's yellow goldish hairs. There's an over here. You have 2 hairs left over. Even if there's yellow hairs, even if it spreads, you're pure. They counterbalance the power of the signs of impurity. They declare the bald spot to be a pure bald spot, to be a healthy spot, not a sick spot, so to speak, because the healthy hairs are still there. What if they came later? So now we're talking about new hairs. That means the person came to the Kohen with a bald spot, and the Kohen inspects it, he sees a yellow goldish hair. And the Kohen therefore declares him to be fully impure because of the yellow goldish hair, or because of a spreading. And then later on 2 hairs grew in the nesek, as long as they're 2. And as long as they're long enough to be bent over, tohar hanesek, it heals. It purifies the bald spot. And they save on account of the spreading or account of the yellow goldish hairs. And here you see condition 3, doesn't matter where they grew, whether they sprouted in the middle of the bald spot or at the edge of the bald spot. Because new growths saves you anywhere. But the leftover hairs does not save unless they're far away from the kama, from the standing hair, by 2 hair breadths. Let's consider the following. The impure hairs for a bald spot are yellow gold. The saving hairs have to be black. What if they're not both black? 2 hairs grew. Achas shcheira v'achas levana. One is black and one is white. Or one is black and one is yellow. Now yellow is a potentially bad sign, but it's only 1, not 2. So the bottom line is you have 2 hairs over here, but they're not both black. Achas aruka v'achas ketzara. Or maybe one is long and one is short. In all of these cases, einon matzilos, they're not going to be a saving mechanism. Now, the commentaries explain one by one the reasoning for all these cases. When it comes to a black hair and a white hair, the reason why the white hair doesn't combine with the black hair to be a savior is because white hair is essentially a siman tuma. Not in the case of a bald spot, but white hair is considered to be a sign of impurity. And because it's a sign of impurity, we can't combine it to be a sign of purity in the case of the bald spot. As far as the yellow hair goes, the commentaries are to say that it's talking about a case where a person became impure because of a spreading. Meaning, he had a bald spot, Kohen put him in quarantine. He goes for a week in quarantine, comes back, the bald spot spread. Kohen declares him to be impure. And now, a black hair and a yellow hair grow. A yellow hair alone, one hair, is not going to make you impure. So now one person might think that since the yellow hair is no longer a siman tuma, maybe it could combine with the black hair to save you. Therefore, the Rambam teaches you no. Even if it's a yellow hair after spreading, it's not going to be a savior. As far as the long hair and the short hair, so because it's not a natural hair, right, because it's short, in the case of yellow hair, it has to be short, but in the case of the black hair, it has to be regular size. So if it's not regular size, then that shows you that it's not a normal hair. Not a normal hair, it cannot save. However, the commentaries do note that it's only true if the hair grew short naturally. If it grew long and somebody cut off one of the hairs and now it's just short because you cut it, that actually is a hair that can save. Let's say you have a bald spot that was declared impure because there was yellow goldish hairs growing in it, or there was a spreading. Then black hair sprouted v'tiher. So it became pure, because new growths of hairs makes it pure. Even if subsequently the black saving hairs fell out, and so now what do you have? Again, a bald spot with yellow hair, which is a sign of impurity typically, because even if the yellow hair came before the bald spot, it's still disqualifying, it still makes you impure. So maybe one might think that the power of the black hairs went away. Says the Rambam, no, tahir. He's pure. A very special law. And the commentaries explain it, and the Rambam will soon give us the source for this. The black hair's appearance in the bald spot shows that the entirety of the bald spot is pure. It heals the bald spot, and it also heals the signs of impurity themselves. They no longer function as a sign of impurity. And therefore, even if the black hair goes away, the bald spot stays pure. Unless or until new yellow goldish hair grows, or new spreading takes place after the black hair goes away. Because then it's a new bald spot with new signs of impurity, which the black hairs did not heal, they didn't save those ones, and therefore you become tameh. What's the source for this? Shenemar, because it says, talking about seir shachar tzamach boy. It's a case where black hair grew in it. What does the Torah say? Nirpa hanesek tahirhu. The nesek has been healed, it is pure. Kevan shenisrape tahirhu. Once it's been healed by the appearance of the sprouting of two black hairs, the whole thing becomes pure. Afal pisha simane tuma b'mikayman, even though the signs of impurity are in their place. And if the commentators explain, this is learned from the extra words here, tahirhu. Torah could have just said, nirpa hanesek. It's a sign that the nesek was healed. Why does it say tahirhu? Tahir means that it's completely pure, even the simane tuma are pure. However, it does say hu to teach us that only it in its current state has been healed, but not forever. If new signs of impurity will grow, then that will become a newly impure lesion, and the nesek will be declared impure once again. Halacha tes, hechlitoi b'seir tzoiv. Let us say that a person had a nesek with a yellow goldish hair, and the Kohen declared him impure. Bein shehechlitoi batchila. It doesn't matter when it was declared impure, whether at the initial inspection, or it was declared impure at the end of 1 week of quarantine or 2 weeks of quarantine, or he became decidedly impure after being sent home in exemption. After 2 weeks went by, nothing happened, and then the sign of impurity showed up. But the point is, there's a yellow goldish hair which made this nesek impure. The holach haseyar latzoiv. Let's show the cases over here. So we have a bald spot with a yellow hair. Okay. Then the yellow hair disappears, and now what happens? The neilad b'seir tzoiv acher. New yellow hair comes. Or a spreading. And when did this happen? This happened before the Kohen had a chance to inspect it. So we have very similar cases when it came to Tzaraas of the skin, where within the space of time when the Kohen wasn't inspecting it, the impure element of the lesion went away, but a new one came back. So the law is that he remains impure, as he was, because the last thing we know that the Kohen knows is impure, the next thing the Kohen knows is impure, still impure. Or if the Kohen had originally disqualified him because of a spreading. Whether after 1 week, 2 weeks, or after exemption. Not at the beginning, because you can't have spreading in the beginning. But after quarantine, there was a spreading and he made him impure. And the spreading went away, but a new spreading came, even in a different place. Or some yellow hair came. Point is, between inspection to inspection, the Kohen only sees signs of impurity. He remains impure until no sign of impurity remains. That's when you become pure. Or until two black hairs will sprout and thereby be a saving mechanism. Halacha Yud. This is a little bit of a complicated halacha. There's two general approaches in the commentaries to how we define the cases being discussed here, and I'll try to deliver both in as clear a fashion as possible. Halacha Yud. Shnei nesakim ze b'tzad ze. We're going to begin with two bald spots. Okay, well imagine this is an area of a person's hair on the head, and there's two bald spots, one next to another. V'shita shel seyar shachar mafsekes beinein, with a column of black hair dividing between them. Okay, so we have one bald spot over here, one bald spot over here. V'nifratz haseyar hashachar, v'nitak mimokim echad. And what happened in the first case? The black hair, the column in the middle, was breached and became open in one area. One area means like this. This is called one area. We'll soon see two areas would mean like up here and down here. In one area of the column was breached, and now there's, so to speak, a crossover between the two neseks. So says the Rambam, Harehu kemais shahaya. What happens is, basically, what's the theory here? The theory here is, maybe this becomes one big nesek. And if it becomes one big nesek, then we have black hair in middle of a nesek. If we have black hair in middle of a nesek, that's a sign of purity. So the nesek shouldn't even have to go to quarantine. No, says the Rambam. Harehu kemais shahaya. It stays as is. And it requires quarantine, like a regular nesek. Can anyone guess why? Because leftover hairs, they're not meeting all three conditions. Because the black hair which remains in between, harehu bitzad hanesek, is at the side of the nesek. Remember, let's just show you the conditions over here. When it's leftover hairs, there has to be at least two hair breadths all around. In this case, while there are two hair breadths, let's say on this side, but there aren't two hair breadths on this side. And therefore, the only way to save such a nesek would be if two new black hairs would grow. But as far as these black hairs are concerned, this is a case of black hairs on the side of the nesek, so it requires quarantine, it's not saved. Now, the big question that the commentaries deal with is, one second, forget the black hairs. Isn't there a sign of impurity by the very fact that the nesek spread? Pisyon. Spreading is one of the things that disqualifies or that makes impure a nesek. So if the Kohen saw it first like this, and now he sees it like this, the nesek spread. That's why he should be impure. So this leads to two general approaches in the commentaries. Tosfos Yomtiv, on the Mishnah, he says, this is talking about before the initial quarantine. The Kohen didn't even have a chance to put him into quarantine. He came to the Kohen for inspection with two neseks. As the Kohen is looking, this hair falls out. Since the hair fell out right at the initial inspection, there's no pisyon, betchila. Pisyon can only happen after a week. So therefore, it's not impure on that account. But if indeed, says Tosfos Yomtiv, if indeed after a week this would happen, then of course, the Kohen would say it's impure on account of the pisyon. The Merkavas HaMishnah says no. This case could even happen after a week of quarantine. Why? Because, as we're going to see, in order for a spreading to be considered a spreading, it has to spread at the width of a gris, 6 by 6 hairs. And here, it only spread at a width of 2 hairs. And therefore, the spreading itself is not a qualifying spreading. And this could have even happened after quarantine. This could have even happened after the Kohen put him away for a week. There's no problem of the spreading because it isn't a big enough spreading. The only question is the black hairs, and on that, the Rambam clarifies that since the black hairs are at the edge of the nesek, they're not in the middle of the nesek, so they don't save it. Okay, this is all if this double nesek breached the wall only from one side. But what if, says the Rambam, nifritza hashita mishnei mekaymais? What if the wall was breached on two sides? So this was the column of hair in the beginning over here. And now there's two points at which the middle thing was breached. Now what do we have over here? We have black hair that's left over in the middle of the nesek. Says the Rambam tohar. This is pure. Shaharei hanishar min hashita be'emtza hanesek. Because what remains from the original column of hair is in the middle of the nesek. So basically what happens, we consider it to be that it breached in two places, it became one big nesek. One big nesek with leftover hair in the middle is absolutely pure. How big does a breach have to be considered a breach? No less than a place of two hair's growths. That's why I crossed out 2 lines of hair over here, 2 lines of hair over here to show you that they meet the basic qualifications of the breach, 2 hairs by 2 hairs. Now, the Rambam says the following words. What if there was a breach on one side the size of a gris? So this 6 words over here becomes a debate in the commentaries. Is the Rambam talking about back to the case of only a breach from one side? He's just saying now the breach was bigger. The breach was as big as a gris. Not like in the original case. Where's that slide over here? In the original case it was a small breach. Maybe this case is talking about a large breach size of a gris. Or perhaps is that Rambam continuing on the case of the 2 breaches, and he's just talking about where one of the sides was a gris. Unlike in the classic case of double breach, was 2 hairs breadth on each side, not a gris. Maybe this is a case where there was a 2-sided breach, but one of them was a gris size. That's the 2 general approaches here. So I'm going to go first with the first approach, okay? That we're talking about a one-sided breach. In other words, this is a second case of one-sided breach. The first case was a small one-sided breach. This is a large one-sided breach. That's how the Aruch HaShulchan explains it. And the Aruch HaShulchan also takes into account the discussion that I mentioned before about when is this taking place. Is it before quarantine or after quarantine? He says it's before quarantine. The person shows up to the Kohen initially with these 2 neseks. As the Kohen is inspecting it, boom, this breach happens. And now the question is, how do we look at this breach? So when it came to the small breach, what did we say? The black hairs are a non-savior because they're on the sides of the nesek. And the breach itself is not considered to be a spreading because it happened before quarantine. And before quarantine, spreading doesn't count. So one might say the same about a breach that's this big. Same thing. The black hairs don't save because they're at the side of the nesek. And the breach shouldn't count as a spreading because the spreading is taking place before the quarantine. Nevertheless, says the Rambam, if the breach on one side was the size of a gris, which the gris is technically a size of a nesek unto itself. Imagine this area was full of hair. This could have qualified as its own nesek. Therefore, the person is considered to be impure. Not because it's a spreading. If it were a spreading, it wouldn't be a problem, because the things can't spread before quarantine. But rather, because this itself is a new nesek. It's a separate bald spot. And the black hair is to the side of it. It's not inside of it, so it cannot be a savior. Now, if you think about it, it doesn't mean that it's actually tameh. We don't have any signs of impurity to make this impure. However, the point is, it's not going to be a helper, and it's not going to be considered pure. It's going to go back to quarantine, back to be potentially impure if a sign of impurity would appear there, because now that it's big enough to qualify as its own nesek, you got to deal with it in a different way. You can't just send it home. Now, that's all the Aruch HaShulchan's approach. But the Merkavas HaMishnah can't explain it this way, because he was the one who said last time that it's talking about after Hesger. This whole case is talking about after quarantine, not before quarantine. So if you learn that it's before quarantine, so you can divide in 2 cases, smaller breach, bigger breach. But if it's after quarantine, you cannot make those distinctions. So therefore, he says, when the Rambam talks about a pirza kigris, we're actually lifting off of this case, the double breach. In the first case of the double breach, it was 2 small breaches. What happens if it's a double breach? I'm reading it again. One of the 2 sides breached at the size of a gris. Unlike in the first case, there was both small breaches. Now one of them is a big breach. So now we can look at this breach in 2 ways. This is fascinating. It's like kind of counterintuitive, flips it on its head. On the one hand, since we're talking about after Hesger, after quarantine, the Kohen could look at this and say, hey, this is a spreading, this is an extension of one of the neseks. If it's an extension of one of the neseks, actually in this case, that works good. because that means that the nesek spread over here and spread over here. And now that we have black hair in the middle, the nesek is saved. However, the other way to look at it is, no, this is a new nesek that has developed here. This is not a spreading of a previous nesek, this is a new nesek. And if it's a new nesek, we cannot combine it with the other nesakim to say, oh, they're one big nesek and there's some black hair in the middle. No. Certainly you can't connect it with the breach over here. It's a whole distinct unit, a whole distinct entity unto itself. That's what the Rambam is saying. Harei zeh tameh. The person is still impure. Now again, impure meaning he's still waiting to see what's going to happen. This current situation is not a reason for purity. Shahapirtza atzma nesek acher. First of all, because this pirtza is a new nesek unto itself. If it's a new nesek unto itself, it cannot be combined with the others. So certainly over here, we don't have these neseks saved. And even this one is not saved because of the black hair over here. Because the black hair is to its side and it's not inside it. Were it to be inside the middle of this new nesek, that would be saved. Now that it's not, nothing can be saved because it doesn't combine with these nor with those, therefore the person is tummy. Now either way, again, I just want to repeat this. Whether you go with the Aruch HaShulchan's approach or with the Merkavas HaMishnah's approach, Tameh doesn't mean absolutely impure. We have nothing that's actually defining him to be impure. There's no sim in Tumah. But it's not pure. The black hairs are not going to be a help to anybody. Because either, again, it's a one-sided breach and we have a new nesek, or because it's a two-sided breach and the same concept, we have a new nesek which cannot be combined with the other blank spaces. So this is all a case where there was two nesakim, one next to each other. Now, let's examine another case. And we've got to still keep track of both opinions here, because it's going to play into this next case as well. Nesek shehaseir hashachar makifai. Let us say we have what we'll call a nesek within a nesek. There's a bald spot in the middle, which is surrounded by black hair. V'nesek acher makif es haseir hashachar. And another bald spot is surrounding the black hair. So unlike the previous case where it was a line of black hair between the two, this is clearly a nesek within a nesek. And this black hair is certainly in the middle of the outer nesek. Now what's important to appreciate about this is that in this case, the outer nesek is certainly pure. Because there's black hair in middle of the nesek. Black left over here in the middle of the nesek will always be a saving mechanism. The whole issue here is the inner nesek. The inner nesek is a bald spot that right now has no signs of impurity, and there's no black hair inside of it. This is the one that's being dealt with. Okay? So again, let's read it inside. Nesek shehaseir hashachar makifai, the nesek acher makif es haseir hashachar. Nesek surrounded by black hair, which is further surrounded by a nesek. And the question is the middle nesek. And first we're going to go with the approach that the person was put into quarantine. The Kohen put him into quarantine on account of the inner nesek. He's waiting to see what's going to happen with the inner nesek after a week. Comes back. Nifratz haseyar shebeineyan mimakom echad. The hair between the two neseks split, was breached in one area. Says the Rambam, we're going to treat this as a spreading of the inner nesek. The inner nesek just had a pisyon. And pisyon after a week is tameh. A person is impure. Shahanesek hapnimi loy nitzal, and you can't tell me that in this case, the inner nesek now becomes one entity through the spreading with the outer nesek, and maybe now it's considered to have black hair inside of it. No. This doesn't save the inner nesek, because we still consider to be, the black hair to be, the black hair is considered to be on the side of it, not inside of it. That's the simple approach, if you want to keep the Rambam's words literal. The other way, going with the other approach of the commentaries, that it's all before Hesger, it's all before the quarantine. So what's the Rambam saying over here, tameh? Not saying tameh because of the spreading. Spreading isn't a sign of impurity before quarantine. He's just saying tameh in the context of it doesn't become pure. Don't think that this spreading now unites the two neseks to the point that it considers this black hair to be in the middle of it. No. Same words. The inner nesek doesn't become saved because of this, because the black hair is still considered relative to it to be outside of it or on the side of it, not inside of it. Now, of course, again, I repeat, the outer nesek is for sure fine, because it has black hairs inside of it, so nothing can make it problematic. However, nifratz haseir mishnei mekaymois, if after a week, we'll go first with that approach. If after a week the nesek splits from two places, so here it goes counterintuitively. On the one hand, you're saying it's a pisyon. There's a spreading. There's a spreading after a week. Shouldn't spreading make it impure? No. Once it splits from two places in this scenario, the whole thing becomes one big nesek. Tahar, the person is pure. Because once it splits from two angles, at this point, the inner nesek doesn't have its own identity. It became one with the outer nesek, and when you have one big nesek with black hair left over in the middle of it, it becomes saved. And now the Rambam adds, Va'afilu hoisa pirza kigris. Even if the breach in this inner nesek was the size of a gris. Now, remember in the last case, when it was nesek beside a nesek, this line had two interpretations. Is it going back to the case of one breach, or it's continuing the case of a double breach, just one breach, one of the two, was the size of a gris. Here, however, I'm going to go only with the approach that it's talking about back to the case of one breach. And why is that? Because the Rambam himself, in his commentary to the Mishnah, writes over here, in this case, clearly that we're talking about the case of the one breach. So the Rambam is going back, even though it doesn't read so well, because ba'afilu usually means even in what we just said, and we're just talking about a double breach. But no, the Rambam is saying, ba'afilu hoisa pirza kigris. He goes back. Even in the case of the one breach, had it been the size of a gris, then that would make both neseks as one. That's the even. The even means that not only in the case of a double breach could it become like one, there's even a case in a single breach where it could become like one, which is if the breach from a single side was the size of a gris. And here the Rambam gives the reason for both cases. Both when there's double breach and one breach size of a gris, both the inner and the outer neseks became one nesek. V'seir shachar ba'emtza, and there is a dark hair in the middle. Dark hair in the middle saves this big nesek. Now, of course, the question we have to ask ourselves is, why is the case of a nesek within a nesek different to the case of a nesek beside a nesek? In the case of the nesek beside a nesek, even when there was a pirza kigris, even when there was a breach on whether either approach, one side or both sides, the point is, if there was a pirza kigris, it didn't have the purification entity, it didn't make them into one. How come over here it does? So the commentaries explain, when you have a nesek beside a nesek, the fact that there's the hair between them is a line, it's a column, right? So the fact that you have some other hair left in that line shows you that the neseks remain separate. There's this nesek on the side, this one on the side, and this new nesek appearing in the middle. But over here, anyway, the inner nesek is completely surrounded on all sides by the outer nesek. So all we have to do is we have to breach the inner nesek, at least at the size of a gris, which shows that it's fully extended into the next one. And once it's fully extended, it assumes the status of the outer one, and therefore becomes pure. Now again, like I said, I'm going with this approach because the Rambam himself writes it in Pirush HaMishnayos, but the Merkebas HaMishnah, who before, in the case of the nesek beside a nesek, understood this case to be a double breach, where one of the breaches is as big as a gris, he says the same thing over here. That this Rambam, Ba'afilu Haisa Pirza Kigris, is a continuation of the double breach, where one of the breaches was the size of a gris, and over there the Rambam is also saying that even there, it's pure. There's some clarification required as to why that is. I don't want to get into it, it's too detailed, so we're going to leave it as it is. And now that Rambam concludes the halacha, and the commentaries say this is actually referring back to the case of the simple double breach, this one over here. That in the case of the double breach, when the Rambam says that it's pure, that's provided that the breach is big enough for 2 hairs breadths. Because of course it isn't coming back to the case of the gris. The gris is bigger than 2 hairs breadths. The Rambam is saying the case of the double breach has to be a size of 2 hairs breadth. In other words, almost like you have to read it as though the whole thing is a parentheses. If you go back to the halacha, nifratz hasera mishnei mekayma is tahar, parentheses, va'afilu hoisa pirza kigris, even a single breach is purifying because it becomes one with the outside. Ba'emtza, end of parentheses. For who, clarifying, in case of double breach, has to be as wide as 2 hairs breadths and no less than that. Okay, the confusing part is over. Let's go to another case. Halacha Yid Aleph, nesek shehayachut yetzem mimenu. We have a bald spot with a strand coming out of it. We had a similar case with lesions on the skin. You have lesions on the skin and there's a strand coming out of it. Same law applies over here. If you have 2 neseks with a strand going between them, if the width of this strand is 2 hairs breadths, Zoikikin litame b'seir tzoiv dak upisyain, they require you to reckon with it in terms of yellow hairs growing in it and spreading, meaning whatever will happen here will affect the larger lesion, and also in a good way. Umatzilin batzemeach bay, it'll save it if any black hair grows here. In other words, because it's 2 hairs breadths long, it's an extension of the original nesek, and whatever happens here will affect the entire nesek. Avol seir shachar hanishar ba'isei, but that's only the black hair of the category of new hairs. But if we're talking about leftover hairs in this strand, einei matzil, doesn't save. Ad sheyeh reichav achut kigris. It's impossible for it to save unless the width of the strand will be a gris. Why? Because one of the core conditions of the leftover hairs is that they have to have 2 hairs breadths on each side. And they themselves have to be 2 hairs. So you're requiring already 6 hairs right there. 2 hairs in the middle, 2 hairs on each side. So this leftover hair cannot be a possibility in this scenario where the strand is just the minimum size of 2 hairs breadths. Halacha Yud Beis. Also, something which compares to the laws of regular lesions. We had yesterday a whole chapter of kulei hafach lavan, right? A person who has a lesion and then it spreads to his entire body. What if that happens with the hair on the head? Misha haya bereishay nesek kigris. A person originally has on his head a bald spot the size of a gris. Upasa hanesek al kol reishay. And then all of a sudden, the whole thing spreads to his entire head. Talking about after the Kohen already saw him. This is not initially. He didn't come with a completely bald head. He came with a nesek, he was inspected, put into quarantine, and then the nesek spreads his entire head. No hairs left at all, only less than 2 hairs. Like when it comes to the person who turns completely white, also over here, it's a sign of purity. Now there's one difference between here and the skin. When it came to the skin, what did we say? That if you come from a state of impurity, you're pure. If you come from a state of purity, like after exemption, you actually become impure. Here it doesn't matter. Whether you became fully bald from a state of quarantine, from a state of definite impurity, or from a state of exemption. Shenemar, because it says, Keireyahu toherhu. When a person is totally bald, he is pure. Total baldness transforms you from becoming impure to becoming pure. And the commentaries actually say that the extra law of no matter which situation you're in is hinted in the first part of the verse. V'ishki moret reishay. If a person's head becomes bald, so the commentaries explain that any situation, if it became bald in any way, shape, or form. Commentaries also add that this is true even if a person had become impure with the nesek and there was a yellow hair. Even if the yellow hair stayed, as long as the rest of the hair becomes bald, it's a sign of purity. So too, till now we're talking about a head. The head became fully bald, but also the beard. If there was a nesek in the beard, became impure, or at least put into quarantine, or exempted, and then it spreads to the whole beard. The whole beard falls out. He's pure. The Afal P says that Rambam, even though this is not clear in the written Torah. In the written Torah, it only says Reisha, the head, not the beard. Kabbalah, it's a tradition. We have from Moshe Rabbeinu on Mount Sinai. Sheim halach kol sarazakan torah. If also if all the hair on the beard disappears, it's also pure. Commentators wonder why it's a tradition. We have clear derivations in the midrash for this from the verses, but there's a whole discussion on that. Anyways, not for now. Now, once this beard becomes fully bald, the skin of the beard area that became bald can become impure benigay oir habasar, using the regular laws of the skin lesions, as we saw in chapter 5. And same is true of the head, as the commentators explain. Once the head or the hair go bald in an unnatural way, while it's purified from the potential of nesakim, it's still included, vulnerable to the tuma of negoyim. Halacha Yud Gimel, we haven't accounted for the person who comes fully bald initially. We've spoken about a person who comes with a nesek and then later goes bald. What if that's how you come? A person comes to begin with his entire head bald, or his entire beard bald. Then, like we had with the skin, you basically treat it as a big nesek. Yazgir shavua echad, put him in quarantine for a week. If there's a problematic sign that comes up during the first week of quarantine, then of course he's impure. If no yellow hairs appear, Yazgir shavua sheni goes for a second week of quarantine. If during the second week of quarantine some yellow short hairs show up, Tameh, he is impure. If not, he's exempted. After 2 weeks, that's the maximum. If yellow hair comes up after the exemption, he is a mukhlat, he is definitely impure. let's say after the person became impure. So he shows up bald. He has a yellow hair grow later. Kohen makes him impure. And now a black hair shows up. How does that tahor? So when new black hair sprouts, that makes you pure. It saves, it heals the nesek. And as the Ravid points out, this is true even if the black hair then falls off. Because once a black hair saved a nesek, it saves it forever, even if the black hair disappears. Now keep that in mind for a second. Says the Rambam another law, if a person shows up at the outset, completely bald, same case as the beginning of the halacha, but the black hair comes right away, before the sign of impurity appeared. Tahar kamesha b'yarnu. He'd be pure, as we explained. Holach haseir hashachar. But if that black hair disappears, tamei mishum pisyain. The black hair is now considered that the nesek spread. The nesek got bigger because the black hair disappeared. Now, of course, as the commentaries point out, that's only true if this was talking about the hair, if this black hair grew right at the edge of the bald spot of the head, right next to where the beard hair began. Or if it was the bald beard, right next to where the head hair began. Because then it's the nesek spreading outwards. But if the black hair would have grown in the middle of the head, let's say, and then disappeared, that's called a pisyon lifnim. That's spreading inward. Spreading inward is not called spreading. Now, this last law about the seir shachar disappearing and becoming a problem is obviously only if there was no other signs of impurity. If there was no, let's say, yellow hairs. But if the black hair had showed up after the yellow hair came, then even if the black hair would fall away, it would stay pure. Because before the sign of impurity showed up, the nesek doesn't need the hair to be healed. There is no sign of impurity. It's healed, or it's not impure essentially. But once the yellow hair shows up, then it needs the hair. Once the hair heals the nesek, it heals it completely. Tahar hu, as we said before. It becomes fully pure. Once it becomes fully pure, there's no way for it to become impure again from the loss of the black hair. Halacha Yudaleh, the Rambam concludes, Hareish v'hazakan, the head and the beard. Even though the laws of nesek apply to both areas, they apply to each area individually, not as a unit. And therefore, einan ma'akvin zeh. They don't hold back each other. They aren't essential to each other. In other words, in the case where a person becomes completely bald, to classify as completely bald, you only have to lose either all the hair on your head or the hair on the beard. Ve'einan mitztarfin zeh. If there's a nesek that crosses the area of the head and the beard, which we'll soon define in a moment where that is, they don't combine. You have half here, they don't combine to be one nesek. They can't spread from one to the other. If you have a nesek at the edge of the head area and it spreads into the beard area, that's not called spreading. Shenemar, because it says, Tzaraas harosh oy hazakanhu. When the Kohen examines the nesek, he says it's either tzaraas of the head or the beard. Melamed shein chashuvin shnayim, which means that it's considered two elements. The ezehu zakan. So where does the beard begin? Where do we call the hair beard hair or head hair? Says the Rambam, mehaperek shel lechi ha'elyon. It begins from the joint at the top of the upper jaw, the temporomandibular joint, if you care about the actual name. It's called TMJ for short. You have TMJ disorders. TMJ, this is the joint, the temporomandibular joint. All the way ad piko shel gargeres, until basically under the Adam's apple, the element that covers the trachea, the windpipe, down to here. Anything past that is called hair of the body. Anything up here is called hair of the head. If you can draw a string, tighten a string from here, one ear to the other, whatever is above the string is considered part of the head hair. What's under the string is called part of the beard hair from this joint and down.